The magistrate had not yet read the charge when Adrian Wycliffe told his wife he believed it. "Do not make this uglier than it must be, Clara," the Duke of Ravencourt said, standing beneath the carved oak crest of his family, while every tenant in the county hall watched her breathe. Clara Wycliffe did not look at him first. She looked at the table before the magistrate, a folded military survey, a brass compass with its glass face cracked down the middle, and a blue ribbon bearing the seal of the War Office. Objects meant to make a woman appear dangerous. Objects arranged by someone who understood that a lie became more convincing when laid out neatly enough. "Your Grace," Magistrate Fenwick began, his voice careful. "The allegation is that Lady Ravencourt copied restricted coastal markings from His Majesty's Survey Office and conveyed them to—" "Read it plainly," Adrian said. The interruption was quiet, but it struck the room harder than a shouted order. Clara finally raised her eyes to him. At 34, Adrian remained devastatingly composed when he wished to be. His dark hair was perfectly tied back. His black riding coat showed not one trace of the rain that had soaked the road outside. The gold signet ring on his hand caught the grey morning light. Only his eyes betrayed him. They were not angry. They were frightened. And fear, Clara had learned after 7 years as his wife, could make a proud man crueler than hatred ever could. "You believe I gave military maps to traitors?" she asked. A murmur stirred among the tenants, the shopkeepers, the estate clerks, and the servants pressed along the back wall. Adrian's jaw tightened. "I believe the evidence must be answered. That is not what I asked." His silence gave her the answer before his words did. "The maps were found in your map room," he said. "Your cipher notes were beside them. Colonel Harrow's office confirms the coast road marked in red is not known outside official circles." Clara glanced down at the survey. The red route ran from Blackwater Harbour through the salt marshes and across the low hill beyond Ravencourt. She had drawn that road herself 3 years earlier, not for the War Office, not for any spy, but because the old drainage channels beneath the Duke's eastern fields had begun to collapse. She knew every line of that map. She knew where the paper had been creased, where the ink had bled after a storm, where her own thumb had smudged the contour of Widow Bell's cottage. But this was not her map. The counterfeit was clever, too clever for a desperate servant or a random thief. The road was correct. The marshes were correct. Even the faded brown markings of the old Roman embankment had been copied with skill. Yet near the lower edge, where the surveyor had imitated her hand, one small line bent north instead of east, a harmless error to anyone else, a fatal one to Clara. The northward line crossed land that had not belonged to Ravencourt for 20 years. It crossed the privately leased acreage controlled by Adrian's cousin, Lord Sebastian Wycliffe. Clara lifted the cracked compass. Rainwater had dried in a pale crescent beneath its brass rim. "May I ask when this was found?" "Yesterday evening," Adrian said. "In the locked cabinet of your map room." "And who opened that cabinet?" "My secretary. Mr. Vale has never had the second key." Adrian's face changed almost imperceptibly. It was the smallest pause, no more than the space between one breath and the next. But Clara saw it. The second key had been kept on a chain in her private writing desk. Only 2 people knew that. Clara herself and Adrian. "You are avoiding the matter," he said. "No," she replied, her voice steady. "I am looking directly at it." At the far side of the hall, Lady Honoria Wycliffe lowered her gaze with the graceful sorrow of a woman attending a funeral. She wore mourning violet, though no one in the family had died. Beside her stood Sebastian, handsome and pale, one gloved hand resting protectively over his sister's wrist. For months, Adrian had listened to their warnings, Clara's insistence on inspecting the harbour books, her refusal to approve Sebastian's land leases, her objections to the costly repairs he called unnecessary. They had named her difficult, ambitious, disloyal to Ravencourt. Now they had given him a grander word: treason. Magistrate Fenwick cleared his throat. "Lady Ravencourt, Until the Crown's representative arrives from London, I must ask whether you deny having made a copy of the coastal survey." Clara placed the compass down with deliberate care. "I deny sending any map to any enemy of England. I deny that this paper was found where they claim, and I deny that my husband had the right to condemn me before hearing a single word in my defense." A woman near the door made a frightened sound. Adrian's expression hardened, not because she had lied, but because she had spoken the truth in front of people who had always been taught to fear his displeasure. "Enough," he said. "You will remain under guard at the West Lodge until this inquiry is concluded." Clara stared at him. The West Lodge had no servants, no carriage, no telegraph access, and only one road out, through land controlled by Sebastian's tenants. It was not protection, it was isolation. Adrian knew it. He had chosen it anyway. Clara reached for the false survey once more, but Lady Honoria moved first.
"Surely she must not touch the evidence,"
she murmured. Her gloved fingers closed around the paper, and for one instant, the sleeve of her violet gown shifted above her wrist. There, caught in the lace cuff, was a grain of dark red sealing wax. Ravencourt wax. The same shade used only on documents taken from the Duke's private cabinet. Clara looked from the wax to Adrian's signet ring. Then she understood why the accusation had been brought before the whole county, why the false map had been made nearly perfect, and why her husband had been hurried into believing it. This was not meant merely to destroy her reputation. Someone needed her removed from Ravencourt before the tide turned at Blackwater Harbour. The guards took Clara from the county hall before noon, but she did not allow them to take her with her head bowed. Rain pressed coldly against the carriage windows as it carried her across Ravencourt's eastern fields, past cottages she had helped save from flooding, past the half-finished drainage works that had occupied every waking hour of her last 2 summers, and toward the abandoned West Lodge, where Adrian had ordered her confined. She watched the land through the glass with a surveyor's eye. The ground was too wet for the season. Water lay in silver sheets between the winter wheat, and the narrow drainage ditches beside the road were already full. Beyond the bare hedgerows, Blackwater Harbour disappeared beneath a low strip of mist. In 3 days, the spring tide would rise higher than usual. If the eastern lock gates failed, the sea would pour through the marshland and drown 6 tenant farms before dawn. Clara had warned Adrian of it twice. Sebastian had called her calculations nervous female fancy. Adrian, exhausted by political visitors and eager to avoid another argument between his wife and cousin, had told her the repairs could wait until summer. Now someone had placed a forged military map in her cabinet on the very week the harbour gates were most vulnerable. The carriage stopped before the West Lodge, a small stone house once used by gamekeepers and now stripped of every comfort except necessity. The footman assigned to guard the door would not meet her eyes. Clara recognized him at once. Thomas Reed had been born in the same village as the tenants along the marsh, and he had served Ravencourt since he was 15. "You are not to receive callers, letters, or newspapers," he said apologetically. "His Grace's orders." "And if the harbour gate breaks?" Clara asked. Thomas swallowed. "I suppose His Grace will send men." "He has sent none." The young man glanced toward the east, where the sky darkened over the sea. Clara stepped inside before he could answer. The lodge had 1 sitting room, 1 bedchamber, and a narrow kitchen with a cold grate. Her trunks had not arrived. Her maid had not been permitted to come. Yet someone had taken the trouble to place a small fire in the grate and set a pot of tea on the table. Beside it lay a loaf of brown bread, a jar of preserves, and an envelope sealed with plain black wax. Clara waited until Thomas had shut the door and his footsteps had retreated across the wet gravel. Then she broke the seal. The note contained only 1 line, in a hand she had not seen since her wedding day. "Do not trust the northern road after dark. Burn this." No name, no explanation. But Clara knew the letters at once. Mrs. Agnes Bell, widow of the old lockkeeper, had taught Clara the hidden language of Ravencourt's fields long before she ever wore a duchess's coronet. Clara had arrived at the estate at 27, the daughter of a civil engineer who had spent his life building bridges, canals, and mill races for men too proud to admit they needed help. Her father had taught her to read gradients before she had learned the names of half the flowers in an English garden. By 15, she could calculate how much rain a channel could carry. By 20, she could look at a field and know where the water would gather beneath the soil. Adrian had admired that skill when they first married. He had followed her through muddy fields in polished boots, laughing as she lectured him about clay banks and floodgates. "You speak of water as if it is an army," he had once told her, drawing her close beneath the cover of his coat. "It is," she had replied. "It takes any weakness as an invitation." Then he had kissed her, as though the world contained no danger she could not warn him against. Somewhere between those early days and this rain-dark afternoon, Adrian had stopped listening when she spoke. Clara folded Mrs. Bell's note and held it above the fire. She should have obeyed. It would have been sensible. A woman accused of treason could not afford secret correspondence with the widow of a lockkeeper, especially not when the note warned her against a road controlled by the very family now accusing her. But the paper was damp at one corner. Mrs. Bell never allowed damp paper into her kitchen unless she had hidden it against her body. She had risked something to send this warning. Clara did not burn it. Instead, she slipped it beneath the lining of her sleeve. At dusk, a knock sounded at the back door. Thomas stood there with a covered basket, his cheeks flushed from the cold. "Cook sent stew," he said, "though I was told to leave it outside." Clara studied him. "Thomas, have the men begun reinforcing the lower bank?" He looked down. "No, Your Grace. Has anyone inspected the east lock?" "Lord Sebastian said he would see to it." "When?" The silence told her enough. Clara opened the door wider. "Come inside." "I cannot." "You can stand in the doorway then." "I am not asking you to disobey His Grace. I am asking you whether the people in Marsh End have been warned." Thomas's face crumpled with the effort of remaining loyal to an order he knew was wrong. "No one has warned them," he whispered. "Mrs. Bell tried to ride to the hall this morning. Lord Sebastian's men turned her back." Clara's fingers tightened around the doorframe. That was why the false map mattered. Not because it would survive serious examination. It would not. The forged route was wrong. The cabinet entry was impossible. And the red wax on Honoria's cuff had been no accident. The accusation's true purpose was to place Clara beyond reach, while Sebastian controlled the harbor, and Adrian defended the lie with his authority. If the lock failed, crops would be ruined, cottages flooded, and desperate tenants would be forced to sell their leases. Sebastian would acquire the marshland for almost nothing. Adrian would call it misfortune, and Clara, locked in a gamekeeper's lodge, would be blamed for every warning she had been prevented from giving. "Thomas," she said quietly, "there is a survey rod in the shed behind this house. Bring it to me after midnight." His eyes widened. "His Grace ordered you confined." "His Grace ordered me silenced," Clara answered. "There is a difference." He stood very still, caught between fear and recognition. Then he gave the smallest nod. When he had gone, Clara drew a map of the eastern marsh, from memory on the back of the food basket's wrapping paper. She marked the lock, the old embankment, the north road Mrs. Bell had warned her against, and the cottages that would be lost first. At the bottom, she wrote one question she could not ignore. If the official charge claimed she had delivered Ravencourt's coastal survey to an enemy, why had its forged red route been designed to lead straight across Sebastian Wycliffe's private land? At midnight, Thomas Reed tapped twice against the kitchen window and slipped into the lodge, carrying the survey rod beneath his coat. Clara had already changed from her damp traveling gown into the plain wool dress she had worn beneath it, dark enough to disappear against the hedges and practical enough to run in. She tied her hair beneath a kerchief, placed Mrs. Bell's warning inside her boot, and took the small oil lantern Thomas had hidden beneath a sack of kindling. "If anyone asks," he whispered. "I brought more coal." "If anyone asks," Clara replied, fastening the last button at her wrist. "You tell them you saw nothing at all." Thomas looked toward the barred front door. "There are 2 men on the road. Then we shall not use the road." Behind the lodge, the old gamekeeper's path ran through a stand of alder trees and descended toward the marsh. Clara had walked it years ago, while mapping the drainage channels, though never in darkness, and never while her own husband's servants had been ordered to keep her prisoner. The rain had stopped, but the air held the sharp metallic smell that came before a tide. Mud pulled at her boots. Brambles caught at her skirts. Thomas carried the lantern low, shielding its flame with one hand, while Clara counted the familiar bends in the path and listened to the water moving invisibly through the reeds. "You should turn back," Thomas said, as they reached the first ditch. "If Lord Sebastian finds you, Lord Sebastian already knows the east lock is failing." Clara crouched beside the ditch and pressed her fingers into the bank. The soil gave way at once, slick and loose beneath the grass. "That is why he needs me afraid." They crossed the marsh by the old timber footbridge, then followed the embankment until the dark bulk of the lock house rose ahead. The building should have shown a lamp in its upper window. Instead, only one faint yellow glow trembled behind the ground floor shutters. Clara stopped Thomas with a hand on his sleeve. The gate mechanism groaned in the distance, a low, tortured sound beneath the rush of water. "Someone is inside," he breathed. Clara lowered herself behind a bank of reeds and peered through the wet darkness. A carriage stood beyond the lock house, its horses blanketed against the cold. The crest painted on its door was unmistakable even in shadow, the Raven of Ravencourt, encircled by the Duke's coronet. Adrian's carriage. But Adrian had told the magistrate he would remain at the hall to assist the Crown's inquiry. He had given her no warning that his household would be inspecting the harbor. A man emerged from the lock house carrying a leather case. Sebastian followed him, holding a lantern. Beside him walked Mr. Vale, Adrian's secretary, his narrow face pale beneath his hat. Clara's pulse slowed instead of quickening. Fear had no use now. Facts did. Sebastian spoke too softly for Thomas to hear, but Clara caught enough as the wind shifted. The upper hinge must be removed before dawn. "Not damaged, removed," Mr. Vale answered. "His Grace expects repairs. His Grace expects whatever I tell him to expect," Sebastian said. "By the time he understands, the marsh leases will be worthless, and the emergency sale will be necessary." The man with the leather case glanced uneasily toward the gates. "There will be families in the lower cottages." Sebastian's smile showed white in the lantern light. "Then they will learn the cost of choosing Lady Ravencourt's counsel over mine." Clara's hand closed around the survey rod. Thomas made a sound of outrage, but she tightened her grip on his arm before he could rise. The men entered the lock house again. Through a narrow opening in the shutters, Clara saw Mr. Vale take out a ring of keys. One key was long, slender, and silver-headed, the second key to her map cabinet. Mr. Vale had not found it. He had been given it. The realization landed with the cold certainty of stone. Adrian had not merely accepted the forged evidence. At some point before the hearing, he had allowed his secretary access to the key that could place it there. Perhaps he had done so carelessly. Perhaps he had believed Sebastian when he claimed an estate document required checking. But carelessness from a duke could ruin people as completely as malice. Clara watched Mr. Vale hand the silver key to Sebastian. Sebastian placed it inside the leather case beside a packet of red sealing wax. "Burn the impression mold," he ordered. "Keep the key. We may have use for it again." Clara looked down at the mud beneath her knees. Embedded near the edge of the path was a small square of pale wood, no larger than a playing card, with 4 tiny brass pins driven into it. It had fallen from the lockhouse door, perhaps from the carpenter's tools, a useless scrap, most people would have thought. Yet the wood was marked with a faint blue stain, the same distinctive indigo dye used on the maintenance tags that Clara had ordered for every gate component After a near flood 3 years earlier, each lock mechanism had been assigned a numbered tag so that repairs could be traced, checked, and charged properly. She slipped the wooden square into her pocket. "What is it?" Thomas whispered. "A piece of a lie." When the men left the lock house, Clara and Thomas moved. They did not go through the door. Clara led him around the rear wall to a narrow drainage opening where the original builders had once allowed overflow water to escape. The iron grate had rusted years ago, and Clara had repeatedly requested its replacement. Now one side had been lifted from its bolts. Sebastian's men had made their work easier by neglecting the very repairs they later meant to blame on the sea. Thomas squeezed through first, then reached back to pull Clara into the black, wet chamber beneath the gates. The smell of brine and old iron filled her throat. Above them, water hammered against the timber barriers. Clara held the lantern close to the mechanism. The upper hinge pin had already been loosened. Another hour of pressure, perhaps 2, and the gate would twist free. "Can we stop it?" Thomas asked. Clara examined the pin, the brace, and the chain running to the hand wheel. "Not permanently, but we can keep it standing until morning." She set the survey rod beneath the iron brace, angled it against a stone support, then used Thomas's belt and her own wool sash to bind the rod in place. It was an ugly, temporary solution. It would not survive a full tide, but it changed the coming disaster from a certainty into a warning. As she worked, her hand brushed a metal plate fastened beneath the hinge. The plate bore a stamped number, E17. Beside it, scratched into the fresh grease, was another number that did not belong there at all, N4. Clara froze. N4 was the designation for the north lock on Sebastian's leased acreage. Someone had taken a hinge intended for the north gate and installed it here, where its smaller pin could never bear the east lock's pressure. The failure had been planned long before tonight. "We must tell His Grace," Thomas said. Clara looked at him through the lantern smoke. "We will tell him, but first we must make certain he cannot choose not to hear." They escaped before Sebastian returned, crossing the marsh by a different route and arriving at the lodge just before dawn, soaked to the skin and shaking from cold. A covered carriage was waiting outside the front gate. Clara recognized Adrian's black horses first. Then she saw him standing beside them, his coat collar turned up against the wind, his face drawn from a sleepless night. For one dangerous second, she thought he had come because he had discovered the truth. Then Lady Honoria stepped down from the carriage behind him, wrapped in violet silk, and Clara understood why he was there. Adrian looked from Clara's mud-stained hem to Thomas's torn sleeve. "What have you done?" he demanded. Clara reached into her pocket and closed her fingers around the blue-stained wooden square. "I have prevented the eastern gate from failing before dawn," she said, "and I have found proof that someone has been preparing that failure for months." Adrian's gaze flickered toward Sebastian, who had appeared on horseback at the far end of the lane with Mr. Vale beside him. For one heartbeat, doubt crossed the Duke's face. Then Sebastian smiled at Clara with calm, murderous understanding. He had seen the mud on her gloves, he had seen the lantern soot on her cheek, and he knew she had been inside the lock house. Sebastian did not dismount at once. He allowed his horse to stand in the rain while he regarded Clara as though she were an inconvenience he had expected to find, and was now deciding how best to remove. Adrian, by contrast, came toward her with quick, angry strides, his gaze passing over the mud on her dress, the torn hem, Thomas's frightened face, and the faint smear of grease across Clara's palm. "You left the lodge," he said. "You ordered me kept there while the eastern lock was deliberately weakened. That is an extraordinary accusation. It is a precise one." Clara drew the blue-stained wooden square from her pocket and held it before him. "This came from the lock house. The east gate bears a north lock hinge, too small for its weight. The upper pin has been loosened. It will not hold the spring tide unless men are sent now, with oak braces, iron clamps, and every available hand." Adrian did not take the fragment. His eyes rested on it, then shifted to Sebastian. Is this true? Sebastian gave a low laugh of disbelief. My dear Adrian, she has escaped confinement in the middle of a treason inquiry, broken into a restricted harbor building, and returned with a splinter of timber as proof that I am conspiring against the estate. The component bears the wrong designation, Clara said. E17 should be fixed beneath the east hinge. It has been replaced with N4. And you alone can identify these marks? Honoria asked softly. She stood beside the carriage, pale beneath the brim of her bonnet, every line of her face arranged into sympathetic concern. How convenient. Clara looked at her. You saw the red wax on your cuff when you visited the county hall. Did you find that convenient as well? Honoria's breath caught. Adrian's head turned sharply toward his cousin. For the first time, Sebastian's composure slipped, only for an instant. Lady Ravencourt is trying to divert attention from her own conduct, he said. She knows no charge against her will survive if she can make enough noise about the lock. Then inspect it, Clara answered. Take your own eyes to the hinge. Take the estate blacksmith. Take Magistrate Fenwick. Let them see the markings before the tide does. Adrian stood motionless. The wind snapped at the edge of his coat. Clara knew him well enough to see the battle inside him. The husband who had once trusted her judgment against the Duke who feared being made a fool before his cousin, his tenants, and the crown. He had chosen pride yesterday. Now the water gave him one more chance to choose differently. Send for the blacksmith, he said at last. Relief touched Clara so suddenly, she nearly hated herself for feeling it. Then Adrian added, and send for Colonel Harrow's officer. Lady Ravencourt remains under guard until the charge is resolved. Sebastian's eyes brightened again. He had not won completely, but he had lost nothing that mattered yet. Clara was still a prisoner. Her voice could still be dismissed. Her knowledge could still be used without granting her authority. You have 2 hours before the upper tide begins to force the gate, she told Adrian. If you waste them proving I am a criminal, Marsh End will pay for it. He turned away before she could see whether the words reached him. By sunrise, the eastern marsh was alive with labor. Adrian had summoned 20 men, the estate blacksmith, 2 carpenters, and a wagon loaded with timber from the hall. Clara was not permitted to direct them openly. She stood behind a mounted guard on the embankment while Sebastian took charge of the work, repeating her instructions in his own authoritative voice. Brace the rod against the lower stone, he called. No, not there. The force will shear it loose. Bring the oak beam beneath the wheel housing. Clara's mouth tightened. He was using her measurements exactly. He had watched her draw them on the wrapping paper in the lodge, then taken the paper from Thomas when the young footman was searched at dawn. Every order Sebastian gave came from Clara's mind, but every tenant who looked toward the lock saw only Lord Sebastian saving Ravencourt's land. She could have shouted the truth. She could have told them that the emergency braces had been her design, that the hinge had been changed on purpose, that Sebastian knew every weakness in the gate because he had arranged it. But the men needed to work, not choose sides in a family war. So Clara swallowed the injustice and watched the structure rise. Mrs. Bell appeared just after 8, walking slowly along the embankment with a wool shawl around her thin shoulders. Thomas slipped away from the guards long enough to help her over the wet ground. The old widow's face was gray with fatigue, but her eyes found Clara at once. She made no gesture of recognition. She simply raised one hand to her breast, where a small silver whistle hung on a chain. Clara understood. The whistle had belonged to Mrs. Bell's late husband, the former lockkeeper. It was used only when a gate was opened or closed in emergency, and the old man had kept written records of every such call. If Mrs. Bell still possessed those records, they could show when the north hinge had been removed, who had signed for it, and whether Sebastian's men had entered the lockhouse before the supposed inspection. Clara's heart gave one hard beat. A witness, not a frightened servant who could be dismissed. but the widow of the man whose hand had maintained the harbor for 30 years. Yet before Clara could reach her, Mr. Vale came hurrying down the embankment with a paper in his hand. He spoke to Adrian, who was standing near the blacksmith. Adrian read the document once, then looked toward Clara with an expression that drained the warmth from the morning. "What is it?" she called. He came to her slowly. "The Crown officer has arrived at the hall. Then he may inspect the forged map. He has brought a second matter." Adrian held out the paper, but not close enough for her to take it. "A letter was intercepted at the Dover post house. It bears your handwriting." Clara saw only the first line before he drew it back. "Dear Captain Renshaw, the tide will give us what the road cannot." Her own hand, her own distinctive slant, her own phrasing. Except Clara had never written to any Captain Renshaw in her life. "It is forged," she said. "You said the map was forged, because it was. And now this letter? Look at the ink," Clara insisted. "It is too dark. I have used iron gall ink since childhood. It fades brown at the edges. Whoever copied my hand used fresh blue-black ink. Look at the final stroke of my name. I never lift my pen there." Adrian's gaze rested on the letter. Clara saw him notice it. He had watched her sign hundreds of estate orders, hundreds of invitations, hundreds of notes to tenants and suppliers. He knew the movement of her hand. The evidence was before him, imperfect and obvious, waiting only for him to acknowledge it. Then Honoria stepped close enough to touch his sleeve. "Adrian," she murmured, "please do not let affection make you vulnerable again." His face closed. He folded the letter and gave it to Mr. Vale. "Lady Ravencourt will be returned to the lodge," he said. "No," Clara replied. The word was not loud, but every worker nearby heard it. Adrian's eyes narrowed. "Clara, I will not return while the tide is still rising, and the people of Marsh End have not been warned. You may place a guard beside me. You may send every Crown officer in England to watch me, but you will not imprison me, while children sleep in cottages that may be under water by noon." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Mrs. Bell stepped forward from the crowd. "Her Grace is right," she said, her old voice carrying over the wind. "And any man who wants to drag her away can answer to me when the water comes." The blacksmith looked down. Then one tenant removed his cap. Another did the same. Adrian stared at them all, stunned by the loyalty Clara had earned without ever asking for it. At last, with anger and shame battling in his face, he said, "She remains here until the gate is secure." It was not freedom, but it was a crack in the wall. Clara went at once to the lower cottages and began moving families uphill, directing carts, livestock, blankets, and children toward the old chapel on the ridge. By noon, the East Lock still stood. The villagers called it a miracle. Sebastian accepted their thanks with a grave nod and stood beside Adrian, as if the success belonged to them both. Then Clara noticed something that stopped her beside the chapel gate. Mr. Vale was leading Mrs. Bell away from the crowd toward a closed carriage on the northern road, the same road her warning note had told Clara not to trust after dark. And hanging from Mr. Vale's hand, just visible beneath his glove, was the old lockkeeper's silver whistle. Clara was moving before she had decided to move. She crossed the chapel yard at a run, catching the edge of her skirt in the mud, and nearly falling as Mr. Vale reached the carriage door. "Mrs. Bell!" she called. The old woman turned once from inside the carriage, her lined face white with fear. Mr. Vale's hand pressed firmly at her elbow. "Her Grace is overwrought," he said. "Mrs. Bell has been asked to make a statement at the hall. Then she may make it in daylight, before witnesses," Clara replied. "Show me the order." "There is no need. There is every need." The carriage driver gathered the reins. Clara stepped directly in front of the horses. Behind her, the chapel bell began to ring, not in celebration, but in warning. Villagers emerged from the shelter, with frightened children clinging to their coats. Adrian came down the slope from the lock. Sebastian, and Honoria at his side. "Clara," Adrian called, his voice carrying across the yard. "Move away from the carriage. Mr. Vale has taken Mrs. Bell's whistle," she said. "He is removing the only living witness who can account for the lock records. Mrs. Bell is not under arrest. Then let her leave by her own choice." Clara turned to the widow. "Agnes, do you wish to go with him?" Mrs. Bell's lips trembled. She looked at Mr. Vale, then at Sebastian, and finally at Adrian. "I only wish to show what my husband kept," she whispered. "That is all I meant to do." "What did he keep?" Clara asked. Sebastian stepped forward. "This is absurd. The woman is confused, exhausted, and being used by my cousin's wife to create another spectacle." Mrs. Bell flinched as though struck. Clara saw the movement. Adrian saw it too. He looked at Sebastian, then at the old woman, and for one brief, precious moment, Clara believed he might finally understand. She reached into the carriage and took Mrs. Bell's hand. "Tell him," she said softly. "Tell His Grace about the records." Mrs. Bell's fingers closed weakly around hers. "The maintenance book," she began. "Elias wrote every hinge and pin, every man who came through the lockhouse, every—" Mr. Vale seized the old woman's shoulder. "Enough," Clara rounded on him. "Remove your hand. You are exceeding your authority, Your Grace." "My authority?" The laugh that escaped her held no humor. "You forged a letter in my hand, planted a map in my cabinet, and now you speak to me of authority?" The chapel yard fell silent. Adrian's face went hard. "You will not make accusations without proof." Clara stared at him. "You mean the proof Mr. Vale is currently carrying away in his hand? The whistle proves nothing. It proves he had access to Mrs. Bell before he took her. It proves he knew what she possessed." "Or it proves," Honoria said gently, "that Mrs. Bell gave it to him because she trusts the Duke's secretary more than a woman charged with treason." Clara looked at her. Honoria's violet sleeve covered both wrists now. No trace of red wax remained. No evidence, except the memory Clara carried alone. That was the terror of a carefully built lie. Every visible sign disappeared, leaving only the liar's confidence and the victim's outrage to stand against it. Adrian stepped closer. "Move away from the horses. Search the carriage," Clara said. "Search Mr. Vale. Let Magistrate Fenwick open any papers they carry. If I am wrong, I will return to the lodge without another word." Sebastian's expression sharpened. "And, if you are right, then Mrs. Bell remains under Ravencourt's protection, and the Crown officer examines the lock records before a single accusation against me proceeds." Adrian's eyes held hers. Clara could see the cost of that choice in him. To order a search would humiliate Sebastian before the tenants. It would admit that Clara's warning might have substance. It would expose Adrian's own failure to investigate her before publicly condemning her. Pride rose behind his eyes like a gate dropping into place. "No," he said. The word was quiet. It was absolute. Clara felt something inside her go still. "No? You will return to the West Lodge immediately. Mrs. Bell will go to the hall, where she will be questioned properly." "By whom?" "Mr. Vale? Sebastian? By the Crown officer when he arrives. You do not know whether she will arrive at the hall." Adrian's jaw tightened. "You are forcing me to choose between the order of this estate and your increasingly reckless suspicions. You chose yesterday," she said. "You chose again this morning. Do not call it order because you are afraid to name it." The color left his face. For a second, pain flickered there, raw and unguarded. Then Sebastian leaned toward him and spoke low enough that Clara could not hear. Whatever he said worked. Adrian straightened, reached for the document Mr. Vale had brought from the hall, and pressed it against the hood of the carriage. "Colonel Harrow's officer has authorized your transfer," he said. "You will be taken to London this evening and held for formal examination." Thomas made a broken sound from the chapel steps. Clara did not. She watched Adrian draw his signet ring from his finger, press it into the sealing wax, and place the Ravencourt Raven beneath an order that would remove her from the estate before the lock records could be examined. The betrayal was no longer an accusation whispered in a hall. It was a duke's signature, a sealed command, and the deliberate use of his power against his own wife. "You are sending me away so they may finish what they began," she said. Adrian's hand closed around the ring. "I am sending you where the law can decide. The law cannot decide what you refuse to see." He did not answer. Mrs. Bell began to cry quietly in the carriage. Clara turned to Thomas. "Go to the lower channel," she said. "Find the temporary brace we set before dawn. Count the waves when the tide turns. If the water rises above the third stone, send the bell ringer to every cottage. Your Grace, go." Thomas hesitated only a second before he ran. Sebastian watched him leave with eyes as cold as river slate. "You see," he said to Adrian, "even now she gives orders as if the estate were hers." Clara looked straight at Adrian. "I give them because someone must protect the people you have placed in danger." The Duke's face changed at that, but not enough. Never enough. 2 guards approached from the road with a closed traveling coach behind them. Clara let them take her arms only after she had turned once more toward Mrs. Bell. The old widow met her gaze through the carriage window and pressed something against the glass. A tiny strip of folded paper, no bigger than a matchbox label, hidden in the hollow of the whistle's chain. Before Clara could reach it, Mr. Vale pulled the curtain shut. The coaches departed in opposite directions. Mrs. Bell's went north toward Sebastian's leased land. Clara's went west toward the main road and London. The East Lock stood behind them, reinforced by the very plan Sebastian had stolen from her. But as the coach climbed the ridge, Clara looked back across the marsh and saw something no one else seemed to notice. The tide was already moving inland, not through the damaged East Gate, but through a narrow black line cutting across the northern fields. A channel that should have been dry, a channel leading directly beneath the road Sebastian controlled. The lock had never been the true target. It had only been meant to keep everyone watching the wrong water. The coach had not traveled half a mile before the road beneath it began to shudder. Clara felt the vibration through the wooden floor, a deep, irregular tremor that did not belong to wheels, horses, or thunder. She turned toward the rear window just as the northern fields vanished beneath a violent sheet of gray water. The black channel she had seen from the ridge had widened into a rushing cut across the land, tearing through the old carriage road and carrying fence posts, broken timber, and whole clumps of earth toward the marsh below. "Stop the coach!" she shouted. The guard opposite her stared. "We are under orders to reach the London road. Then you will reach it at the bottom of a flood. Stop the coach." The driver had already seen it. Horses screamed outside. The coach lurched sideways as the front wheel sank into mud, throwing Clara hard against the door. One guard cursed and reached for the handle, but the ground beyond it cracked open with a sound like splitting timber. Water burst across the road, waist deep and rising. Clara pushed herself upright, ignoring the pain in her shoulder. "The northern culvert has been opened," she said. "Not the lock. The old salt channel." "What salt channel?" the guard demanded. "The one built before any of you were born. It runs beneath the road from the sea inlet to the abandoned salt pans. It was sealed after the Great Storm of 1798 because the current cuts through the foundation whenever the tide is high." She pressed her face to the glass. The road was already collapsing along the exact line she had marked from memory on the wrapping paper. Sebastian had not intended merely to flood the tenant fields. He had reopened the buried channel beneath the northern road, knowing the spring tide would turn it into a knife. When the road went, the east side of Ravencourt would be cut off from the harbor. The grain warehouses could not be reached, the emergency stores could not be moved, and the Crown supply wagons, scheduled to pass through Blackwater in 2 days, would be forced to halt on the estate. A military delay, a forged coastal map, a duchess accused of treason. It would all become one convincing story. "The bridge at Mill Crossing," Clara said. "How far?" "2 miles." The driver called through the rain. "It will be gone within the hour. Then turn back. The road behind us is flooding. Not toward the Chapel Ridge. Take the old quarry track." The driver looked back at her in disbelief. "That path hasn't been used since the limestone carriage overturned 15 years ago." "I know. The upper ground is still sound because the quarry drains west, not north. Turn the horses now, or we lose them." The coachman hesitated. Then another section of road dropped away beneath the lead horse's hooves. He swore, yanked the reins, and forced the team toward the narrow rise that cut through the fields. The guards clung to the carriage rails as it bucked through deep mud. Clara braced herself with both hands against the roof, calling directions through the window. "Left at the broken oak. Keep above the stone wall. Do not take the hollow where water gathers." She had not ridden the quarry track in years, but her mind still held the land as precisely as a page. Behind them, the main road disappeared beneath the flood. Ahead, the ridge rose dark and narrow through the storm. They reached the chapel just as the bell began to ring again. This time it did not stop. Men and women poured from the building, carrying children, bedding, sacks of flour, and whatever possessions could be lifted quickly. Thomas ran toward the coach, with his coat soaked through and blood on one cheek. "The north bank is gone," he gasped. "Water's taking the lower cottages." Clara stepped down before either guard could stop her. How many families? 7, still trapped beyond the mill. Boats? 2 fishing skiffs at the chapel pond, but no one can reach them. Clara turned to the guard. "Your prisoner has just saved your life. You may either keep holding my arm while people drown, or you may carry a child to higher ground." He looked at the flooded fields, then at the frightened faces gathered around them. His grip loosened. "What do you need?" he asked. Clara did not thank him. There was no time. She sent Thomas to the pond with 4 men and told the driver to unhitch the strongest pair of horses. She used the chapel register table as a command board, marking the cottages, the rising channels, and the safest paths with charcoal. The vicar's wife brought blankets. The blacksmith gathered rope. A young mother began sobbing that her husband was still in the mill house, unable to leave because his injured brother could not be carried. Clara took the survey rod from Thomas, measured the current against the chapel steps, and calculated how long they had before the lower road became impassable. 30 minutes, she said. After that, the water will cross the orchard and force them toward the mill wheel. We take the boats through the drainage ditch, not the road. That ditch is too narrow, Thomas said. It is narrow until it reaches the willow bend. Then it opens into the old mill race. If the sluice door is still intact, it will carry a skiff directly behind the house. And if it is not, then we do not come back. The first boat launched under a sky the color of iron. Clara stood at the bow with one hand on the rope line, guiding them through drowned hedges and over water that concealed every ditch, stone, and fence post beneath its surface. The guards rowed. Thomas kept watch for debris. At the willow bend, the current seized the skiff and spun it so sharply that one of the guards nearly went overboard. Clara caught the rope, wrapped it once around the survey rod, and drove the rod against the trunk of a half-submerged willow. The boat held. "There," she said, pointing through the rain. The mill house roof rose above the water, and figures waved from an upper window. They made 2 trips before the mill wheel collapsed. On the 3rd, they found not only the trapped family, but a boy from the nearby tenant cottages, clutching a soaked leather folio to his chest. "My father told me to keep it dry," the child whispered. "He said Lord Sebastian's man threw it away when they opened the ground." Clara opened the folio beneath her coat. Inside were engineering sketches, survey invoices, and a signed order authorizing excavation of the northern culvert. The name at the bottom was not Sebastian's. It was Adrian Wycliffe's. Her husband's signature had given the work legal entry onto Ravencourt land 6 months earlier, when Sebastian told him the quarry track required routine drainage improvement, Adrian had not read the detailed plans. Clara knew it at once, because the sketch showed the salt channel in red and the proposed drainage in black, a distinction no man who understood the estate would have missed. But he had signed. He had placed the family seal on the very work that now threatened to destroy them. When they returned to the chapel, Adrian was waiting in the flooded yard. His coat was torn, his boots thick with mud, and there was no trace of the remote Duke who had sealed her transfer order that morning. Behind him stood Colonel Harrow's officer, Captain Edmund Sloane, holding a dispatch case beneath his arm. Clara climbed from the skiff with the folio in her hands. Adrian saw his signature before she said a word. His face went white. "Where did you get that?" "From a child whose father was nearly swept away by the channel you authorized. Sebastian said it was drainage, and you believed him." Captain Sloane took the papers from Clara, scanning the red-marked plans with increasing alarm. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "if this channel reaches the harbor road, the Crown wagons cannot pass. The supply convoy arrives at Blackwater on Friday." Adrian looked toward the northern flood, where the broken road had become a widening river. "I will order men from every village," he said. Captain Sloane's expression did not soften. "Your men are already scattered, and your estate accounts have been frozen pending the inquiry into Lady Ravencourt's correspondence. You cannot pay contractors without authorization." The consequence landed with brutal clarity. By publicly accusing Clara, Adrian had invited Crown scrutiny. By signing Sebastian's papers, he had armed the scheme. By sending Clara away, he had nearly removed the only person capable of seeing it. And now, with the tide still rising, his title could not command timber, labor, or credit into existence. Clara took back the folio. "The channel will not stop at the road," she said. "It is cutting toward the lower salt pans. If it reaches the old powder store beneath the harbor warehouse, the whole eastern quay will go up." Captain Sloane looked at the map. Adrian looked at Clara. Far beyond the chapel ridge, a dull explosion sounded beneath the roar of the water. Then a column of black smoke rose from Blackwater Harbor. The smoke rising from Blackwater Harbor was not from the powder store. Clara knew that before anyone else did. It was too dark, too oily, and too low to the ground. The old salt channel had reached the coal sheds beside the quay, where floodwater had overturned lamps and driven frightened dock workers toward the warehouse district. The explosion they had heard was a boiler rupturing under sudden cold water. Dangerous, but not yet the catastrophe Captain Sloane feared. "The powder store is farther east," Clara said, forcing herself to think beyond the terror in every face around her. "The channel will not reach it unless the water is allowed through the old floodgate behind the customs house." Captain Sloane looked from the folio to the harbor smoke. "Can it be closed?" "Yes, but not from the quay. The wheel is inside the abandoned salt works." Adrian's eyes fixed on her. Sebastian's leased land. Exactly. The Duke said nothing. Around them, the chapel yard had become a camp of soaked families and frightened livestock. The Crown officers' clerks had claimed the parish table for their papers. The guards who had once been ordered to take Clara to London now stood waiting for her instructions beside the rescue boats. She could feel the strange shift in the air. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. People had watched her read the flood before it came. They had watched her lead the boats. They had watched her husband sign an order against her, and they had watched that order nearly leave them all stranded in rising water. Clara turned to Captain Sloane. "I will go to the salt works." Adrian stepped forward at once. "No," she met his gaze. "You have no authority to forbid me now." The words struck him visibly. He glanced at Sloane, who did not come to his rescue. "Lady Ravencourt," the captain said, "if you can stop the flood from reaching the military stores, you will have the support of the Crown." "Not the Crown," Adrian said hoarsely. "Me. You will have my support." Clara looked at the mud on his coat. the ink stain still dark at the edge of his thumb from the transfer order he had signed that morning. A few hours ago, she would have taken those words as hope. Now they sounded like another form of possession. "You may provide men, horses, and rope," she said. "You may not speak for me, decide for me, or remove any witness from my sight." Adrian's throat worked. "Agreed. And Mrs. Bell is found before we leave." Sebastian had vanished during the chaos. So had Mr. Vale. Honoria, Clara noticed, was nowhere in the chapel yard. Adrian's expression tightened with sudden alarm. "I sent men to the hall. Send others north," Clara said. The carriage was headed toward the salt works. They did not take Agnes to question her. They took her because she knows the records. Captain Sloane gave orders, and within minutes, 3 mounted constables rode toward the northern road. Clara gathered a smaller party for the harbor: Thomas, the blacksmith, 2 guards who had rode with her, and Captain Sloane himself. Adrian insisted on coming. Clara did not forbid it. Let him see every consequence of what he had chosen. The old quarry track had become a scar of mud, but the higher ground remained passable. They reached the salt works near sunset. Its stone chimneys stood black against the red-gray sky, and water poured through the broken yard gates in thin, violent streams. Clara led them around the back wall to a small brick building half buried in reeds. "The floodgate wheel is beneath this floor," she said. "If the channel is open, the room will be filling." Thomas kicked in the warped door. Inside, the water had risen to Clara's knees. The iron wheel was there, just as she remembered, but a chain had been wrapped around it and secured with a new padlock. Sebastian had not merely opened the old channel. He had made closing it impossible without time, tools, or a key. The blacksmith bent to inspect the lock. "I can break it," he said. "How long?" 10 minutes. Clara listened to the water battering the wall. "You have 5. Adrian seized a crowbar and drove it beneath the chain. No one spoke as he worked. Each blow rang through the chamber, fierce and useless at first, then more desperate. Clara knelt beside the wheel housing and ran her fingers across the metal. There was a second mechanism beneath it, one designed for winter ice, a release pin that would allow the wheel to drop its pressure and turn manually. Her father had shown her a similar system when she was 14, laughing as she dismantled it faster than his apprentices. She found the pin beneath a layer of hardened salt and used the edge of her hairpin to clear it. "Move," she told Adrian. "What?" "Move." He stepped aside without argument. Clara pulled the pin free. The wheel groaned, spun half a turn, and sent a blast of freezing water through the room. Thomas caught the rope around the handle. Adrian took the other side. Together, at Clara's command, they forced the gate shut, inch by inch, until the roaring channel beyond the wall became a heavy, weakening thud. Outside, the floodwater began to draw back from the salt pans. The harbor would survive the night, but the evidence was still in Sebastian's hands, and Clara knew saving the estate was not the same thing as saving herself. They found Mrs. Bell, after dark, in a disused storage room above the saltworks. She was alive, bound to a chair, exhausted but conscious. Honoria had left a lamp burning beside her, and the lockkeeper's silver whistle on a crate within sight but beyond reach. It was cruelty made theatrical. Clara cut the ropes herself and wrapped the old woman in Adrian's coat before anyone else could touch her. "The paper," Mrs. Bell whispered. "What paper?" "In the whistle chain. I put Elias's last note there. He knew they were changing the hinges." The whistle lay on the crate. Clara opened the chain's hollow clasp with trembling fingers and drew out the narrow strip of paper she had seen through the carriage window. It was not a full record, only a notation in the dead lockkeeper's hand. N4 removed by order of SW. East fitting altered before March audit. Duplicate book hidden where the raven cannot fly. Clara read it twice. "Where is the duplicate book?" she asked. Mrs. Bell closed her eyes. "Your map room." Clara went still. The map room at Ravencourt Hall. The room she had been accused of using to betray the crown. The room now likely searched, sealed, or destroyed. Yet the phrase made sense. Where the raven cannot fly. The ducal crest was carved above every high shelf, every door, every cabinet in the house. But there was one place Adrian's crest did not reach. The narrow drainage model beneath the floorboards. Built when Clara first mapped the marshes. A child could crawl through its maintenance opening. A book could be hidden there for years. "We must return to the hall," she said. Adrian looked at the note in her hand. "Sebastian will know what it means. He already does." They arrived at Ravencourt near midnight to find the map room door standing open. A fire burned in the grate. The cabinets had been emptied. Papers lay scattered across the floor like pale leaves after a storm. Clara crossed the room and dropped to her knees beside the large wooden model of the estate that occupied the center table. The miniature marshes, locks, roads, and fields were still there. She pressed the hidden latch beneath the north embankment. Nothing happened. Her breath caught. The compartment was empty. Adrian stood behind her, silent. On the floor beside the model lay one object Sebastian had not bothered to burn. The little blue-stained wooden square Clara had taken from the lockhouse. Except this one was not hers. This one had been split cleanly in half, and on its underside, written in fresh ink, were 6 words. "Bring the duplicate book to Kingsmere Hall." Beneath the message was a date, tomorrow night. The note lay on the floor between Clara and Adrian. Its 6 inked words, more threatening than any pistol. "Bring the duplicate book to Kingsmere Hall, tomorrow night." Sebastian was not asking for evidence he believed Clara possessed. He was staging a final exchange in the one place where he could control the audience, the servants, the doors, and the story told afterward. Kingsmere Hall belonged to his mother's family and stood on high ground beyond the marsh, far enough from Ravencourt to be safe from the flood, and close enough to host the county's most influential landowners. Tomorrow night, those same men would gather there for the emergency meeting Captain Sloane had called to address the ruined harbor road and the delayed crown convoy. Sebastian intended to turn crisis into opportunity. He would arrive with a forged map, a counterfeit letter, a frightened secretary, and perhaps a stolen ledger presented as proof that Clara had sabotaged the estate to conceal treason. Then he would offer himself as the only Wycliffe capable of restoring order. "He wants us to come," Adrian said. "He wants me to come," Clara corrected. "You are only the title he plans to inherit from the wreckage." Adrian flinched, but she had no strength left to soften the truth for him. The map room smelled of wet ash and scorched paper. Mrs. Bell slept upstairs under the care of the housekeeper, while Thomas stood guard outside her door with the blacksmith's hammer tucked beneath his coat. Captain Sloane had sent constables to search the northern road, but Mr. Vale and Honoria had vanished with Sebastian before the saltworks were discovered. Ravencourt Hall, once filled with polished certainty, now felt hollow and watched. Clara moved to the drainage model again and studied the empty compartment beneath the miniature north embankment. "The duplicate book was never here," she said. "What makes you so sure?" Adrian asked. "Because Elias Bell was not foolish enough to hide the only copy in the same room where he hid the clue. The phrase was meant to make Sebastian believe it was here." She touched the carved miniature raven on the model's highest tower. "Where the raven cannot fly. I thought it meant beneath the floor. But the raven cannot fly underground either, and Elias would have known Sebastian would search every hidden compartment in this room. Then what does it mean?" Clara looked toward the window. Beyond the rain-streaked glass, the chapel ridge rose black against the clouds. "A raven cannot fly where there is no air." Adrian frowned. "The old stone culvert," she said. "The section beneath the chapel. Elias used to inspect it after every storm. He called it the blind throat of the estate." Thomas, standing in the doorway, went pale. "That culvert feeds the crypt." Clara turned sharply. Beneath the chapel lay a small family vault, older than Ravencourt Hall itself. During the drainage works, she had found a sealed inspection hatch leading from the culvert into a disused storage chamber beside the crypt. It was dry, stone-lined, and invisible from above. A place a lockkeeper could reach. A place Sebastian's men would never think to search, because it did not appear on any estate map he had bothered to read. "We leave now," Clara said. Adrian stepped in front of the door. "No, it is after midnight. Sebastian has already tried to remove Mrs. Bell and destroy the map room. You cannot go into a flooded culvert with 2 servants and a boy. Then do not come. Clara, you forfeited the right to command me when you used your seal to send me away without hearing me." Her voice did not rise, but it stripped the room of every illusion he had been holding on to. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke again, his tone was lower. "You are right." The words were simple. They were not enough, yet she heard the cost in them. "I believed Sebastian because it was easier than admitting I had allowed him too much power. I believed the evidence against you because I was ashamed that you saw weaknesses in the estate I should have seen myself. And when you asked me to look closer, I chose the explanation that preserved my pride." Clara said nothing. He continued, his face drained of color. "Tomorrow at Kingsmere, I will state that publicly. I will withdraw the accusation against you before every man I ask to believe it. That will cost you. It should. It will not restore the day you sent guards to take me from my home." "No." His voice broke on the word, but he did not reach for her. "Nothing I do will restore that." Clara held his gaze, then moved past him. "Good. Then begin by helping me recover the truth, not by asking what it can repair between us." They reached the chapel shortly before dawn. The flood had receded from the upper ground, leaving the grass silvered with mud and broken reeds. Captain Sloane came with them, along with the blacksmith and 2 constables. Clara led the group behind the chapel altar, through a narrow stone doorway hidden by old funeral drapes, and down a flight of damp steps to the crypt. The Wycliffe dead lay in their carved niches beneath the floor, their names worn soft by time. At the far wall, Clara found the iron inspection hatch exactly where memory had placed it. The hinges were wet but unbroken. Behind it, the blind throat of the estate ran black beneath the chapel. Thomas held the lantern as Clara crawled inside first. The passage was scarcely high enough to kneel in. Cold water pressed around her boots. 20 feet in, she reached a recess in the stone and found a small tin box sealed with pitch. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside lay the duplicate maintenance book, wrapped in oilcloth, its pages dry and intact. Beside it was a second object, a brass die used to stamp the blue maintenance tags. Its face bore the reversed letters N4. Clara understood at once. The small blue-stained wooden square Sebastian had left in the map room had not been a taunt alone. It had been cut from a tag block. The same blue dye used on the lock components had been pressed into wood with the brass die, creating false repair markers. Sebastian had altered the hinge records, then planted tags to make the substitution look ordinary. But he had made one arrogant error. The letters on a proper tag were stamped forward. On the wooden squares, the letters appeared backward because the die had been pressed directly into the wood by someone who did not understand the difference between a stamp and its impression. Clara emerged from the culvert holding the book and brass die as dawn broke over the chapel windows. For one breath, hope returned. Then Captain Sloane's constable came running across the churchyard with a message from Ravencourt Hall. The Crown officer assigned to examine Clara's treason charge had arrived during the night. Honoria Wycliffe had delivered a sworn statement accusing Clara of bribing Mrs. Bell, fabricating the maintenance book, and conspiring with Captain Renshaw to attack the Crown convoy at Kingsmere Hall. "She has witnesses," the constable said. "Mr. Vale is among them, and the Crown officer has ordered Lady Ravencourt detained until the hearing." Adrian's hand went to his sword belt. "No," Captain Sloane stepped between them. "If you defy the order, Your Grace, you make her appear guilty." Clara looked down at the brass die. then at the maintenance book in her hands. Sebastian wanted a hearing at Kingsmere. Honoria wanted Clara brought there in chains. They believed the evidence they had stolen, burned, and forged had left her with nothing but a desperate accusation. Clara closed the book and gave it to Thomas.
"Let them detain me," she said.
Adrian stared at her. "Clara, no one searches a duchess's gloves in front of a room full of peers," she replied. She slipped the tiny brass die into the lining of one glove and looked toward the road to Kingsmere Hall. And no liar can resist correcting a record when he believes it is already his. By the time Clara arrived at Kingsmere Hall, the accusation against her had already become the evening's entertainment. Lamps blazed in every upper window of the great stone house, and carriages crowded the sweep before its doors. County magistrates, landowners, military clerks, shipping men, and 2 representatives from the War Office passed beneath the Wycliffe family arms, while servants whispered behind their hands about the Duke's traitorous wife. Clara entered between 2 constables, not because she was afraid, but because Sebastian had arranged for her to look defeated. Her gown was plain black, borrowed from the Ravencourt housekeeper after her own trunks had been searched at the hall. The brass die lay hidden inside the cuff of her left glove. Beneath her cloak, strapped flat against her waist, was the duplicate maintenance book Thomas had carried from the chapel. Mrs. Bell had been brought to Kingsmere in a separate carriage under Captain Sloane's protection, though no one outside their small circle knew it. The old widow waited in a side room with the vicar's wife and 2 crown constables. The blacksmith waited in the coach house with the original E17 hinge plate. Thomas waited near the servants' corridor with the blue-stained wooden square Clara had found at the lock house. Every witness had a place. Every object had a path. Adrian walked 3 paces behind her, not beside her. It had been his choice. When the doors of the assembly room opened, the crowd fell silent. Sebastian stood near the fireplace in a dark green coat, perfectly composed, as though the flood had been an unfortunate inconvenience from which he alone had emerged untouched. Honoria sat at a small table near the magistrate, veiled in mourning violet, one gloved hand folded over the other. Mr. Vale stood behind her, with his shoulders drawn tight, holding a leather dispatch case. On the central table lay the forged map, the letter supposedly written by Clara, and a second ledger bound in dark leather. Clara recognized it at once as a counterfeit. The cover imitated Elias Bell's hand-marked maintenance book, but the corners were too clean, the leather too new, and the pages carried none of the salt stain that clung to every object ever kept near the lock house. Magistrate Fenwick rose. "Lady Ravencourt, this inquiry concerns the disruption of Crown supply routes, suspected correspondence with Captain Renshaw, and evidence of deliberate interference with the Ravencourt Harbour Works. It also concerns attempted murder, unlawful confinement, forged documents, and the destruction of tenant property," Clara said. A stir passed through the room. Sebastian gave her a patient smile. "Still determined to make yourself the injured party?" "No," Clara replied, determined to ensure there are no more injured parties. The magistrate began with Honoria's statement. In a voice softened by apparent grief, she described Clara's supposed fury over Adrian's decision to question her conduct. She claimed Clara had offered money to Mrs. Bell in exchange for false testimony. She claimed Clara had confessed, in private, that the harbour failure would create confusion enough for a military route to be exploited. Each sentence was polished, plausible, and carefully empty of details that could be checked. When Honoria finished, the magistrate turned to Mr. Vale. "You confirm this account?" Vale swallowed. "I do." "And the letter?" "I received it from Lady Ravencourt's correspondence tray." "When?" Clara asked. Vale blinked. "The morning before the county hearing." "At what hour?" "Near 10. "Then you must explain why you were at the East Lock House at that same hour, holding the second key to my map cabinet." A murmur swept across the room. Vale's eyes flicked toward Sebastian before he could stop himself. I was not. Thomas Reed saw you there, Clara said. So did I. You carried the key in a leather case beside red sealing wax and were instructed to burn an impression mold. Sebastian's smile vanished. The word of a servant against my secretary is hardly proof. No, Clara agreed. It is a beginning. She turned to the magistrate. The letter says, the tide will give us what the road cannot. Does it not? Fenwick nodded. Then it was written by someone who knew the northern road would fail before the tide reached it. She lifted the forged coastal survey from the table. And this map marks a red route across Lord Sebastian's private acreage, where the buried salt channel was illegally reopened. The writer of this letter knew the road would be cut because the same person had prepared the channel beneath it. Sebastian folded his hands behind his back. A dramatic theory, but the channel work was lawfully authorized by the Duke. Every eye turned to Adrian. He did not retreat from it. I signed the authorization, he said. His voice was low, but clear. I did so without reading the detailed plans. My wife objected to the work. I dismissed her objections. That failure is mine. The room changed around him. Men who had greeted him with bows an hour earlier now looked at him with a different calculation. A duke admitting negligence before crown officers was no small wound. But Adrian continued. I also ordered Lady Ravencourt confined and transferred before any proper examination of the evidence against her. I did so because I trusted my cousin's account over my wife's knowledge of an estate she had protected for years. Clara did not look at him. His confession belonged to him, not to her. It could not become the center of what she had come to prove. Lord Sebastian says the channel work was lawful, she said. Then he can explain why the east lock contained a north lock hinge. The blacksmith was brought from the coach house. He placed the E17 plate on the table beside the false ledger. Clara asked him to identify it. He did, describing its size, the forge mark, and the way the metal had been filed to fit the wrong gate. Sebastian interrupted twice, but the blacksmith did not falter. Clara then called Thomas forward. The young footman held up the blue-stained wooden square. I saw Lord Sebastian at the lock house, he said. I saw Mr. Vale give him the silver-headed key, and I saw this piece on the ground outside. Sebastian's voice sharpened. A servant claims to have seen shadows in a storm. Is that the whole of your case? Not at all, Clara said. She crossed to the central table and opened the counterfeit ledger. This book records that the N4 hinge was removed for repair in January. Yet the east lock was inspected by Mrs. Bell's late husband on the 1st of February, and his report lists its original E17 fitting as intact. A book produced by a woman who admits concealing it, Sebastian said. A book you have not seen, Clara replied. This is not Elias Bell's book. The room fell quiet. She turned the false ledger toward the Crown officer. Its pages are machine-cut in a pattern introduced by the London binder Mr. Fenner only this year. Elias Bell died 18 months ago. Its leather has never absorbed salt water, and its maintenance entries use the word culvert in a hand that writes the letter T with a high crossbar. She looked directly at Mr. Vale, the same hand that wrote the false letter in my name. Vale's lips parted. No sound emerged. Honoria rose abruptly from her chair. This is preposterous. Lady Ravencourt has had days to invent explanations. Days? Clara asked. You mean the days during which you had me detained, sent Mrs. Bell north, burned my map room, and asked me to bring evidence to this house? Honoria's face turned bloodless. Sebastian stepped toward the table. That message was planted by you. Of course it was not. You made one mistake. Clara removed her left glove. The brass die slid into her palm. Gasps moved through the assembly as she held it up beneath the lamps. You believed a maintenance tag and its impression were the same thing. Captain Sloane came forward with a small tray of softened wax. Clara pressed the die into it, then lifted it slowly. The raised letters appeared in reverse. N4. She placed the blue-stained wooden square beside the wax impression. The same reversed letters, the same spacing. the same tiny crack beneath the number 4. "This die made the false marks," she said. "It was hidden with Elias Bell's true book in the chapel culvert, a place no one could discover without knowing the estate's drainage model." Sebastian's eyes narrowed. "You have proved only that someone used a die. Then perhaps you can tell this room why the false tags were pressed backward," Clara said, "or why the die was hidden beside a note naming your initials, SW. The magistrate leaned forward. "What note?" Clara looked toward the side door. Captain Sloane nodded once. 2 constables opened it, and Mrs. Bell entered slowly on the vicar's wife's arm, the silver whistle hanging at her throat. Sebastian's composure fractured at last. He moved toward the door, then stopped when he saw the Crown officers blocking the way. Mrs. Bell crossed the room until she stood beside Clara. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. "My Elias wrote the note," she said. "He saw Lord Sebastian's men take the hinge. He made a copy because he knew they would call him a liar." Sebastian turned to the magistrate with sudden fury. "An old woman can be coached. Then let us use the part no one can coach," Clara said quietly. She opened the true maintenance book to the final marked page and laid it beside the brass die. "There is one record here that neither Lady Honoria nor Mr. Vale could have known existed. One entry written before Elias died, naming the person who ordered the false N4 fitting placed beneath the east lock." She looked at Sebastian, then at the Crown officer waiting to read it aloud. "And it bears a witness mark that only the man who made the order can explain." Captain Sloane took the maintenance book from Clara's hands and opened it to the final marked page. The room had become so quiet that the crackle of the fire seemed indecent. He read Elias Bell's entry aloud. "March the 3rd. Lord S.W. ordered the north hinge brought by night and set at east lock. Said no ordinary signature was to be left. Mark made with left thumb, as right hand injured by riding full." Beneath the words lay a dark, oval print pressed into old blue grease, clear enough to show the whorl at its center. Sebastian's right hand was immaculate. His left glove, however, had not been removed all evening. Clara had seen it when he arranged the false ledger, when he gripped the edge of the mantle, when he tried to leave the room. He wore the glove because beneath it was the old scar he had earned in a hunting fall years before, a cut across the base of his thumb that had healed unevenly and made his print unmistakable. "This proves nothing," Sebastian said, though his voice had lost its calm. "Anyone could have copied a thumbprint, not from a man who did not know he had left one," Clara replied. Captain Sloane asked him to remove the glove. Sebastian refused. The magistrate asked again. When 2 Crown officers stepped forward, he tore the glove off himself and flung it onto the table. The scar was there, pale, crooked, and unmistakable. The Crown clerk inked his thumb and pressed it against a clean sheet. Then he placed the new print beside Elias Bell's old grease mark. Even from where she stood, Clara could see the same broken wall, the same narrow ridge cut by the scar. The silence broke all at once. Honoria rose so quickly that her chair fell backward. Mr. Vale backed toward the door, but the constables were already there. Sebastian looked from the print to Adrian, as if his cousin's title might still shield him. "You signed the channel plans," he said. "You gave me the authority." Adrian did not deny it. "I did," he said. "I signed them without reading them. I trusted you because it was easier than admitting I had failed my estate. But you forged evidence against my wife, sabotaged the lock, endangered tenants, and used my authority to do it. That is yours." Sebastian's face twisted. "And what are you then? You put her in chains. You made her a traitor before anyone else had the chance." Adrian's eyes closed for one brief moment. "Yes," he said, "I did." The words did not excuse him. They did something harder. They made it impossible for the room to pretend he had been merely deceived. Captain Sloane ordered Sebastian, Honoria, and Mr. Vale detained pending charges of conspiracy, forgery, false testimony, sabotage of Crown supply routes, and unlawful confinement of Mrs. Bell. Mr. Vale broke first. Before he reached the door, he confessed that Honoria had supplied Clara's old letters for imitation, that Sebastian had ordered the duplicate key copied from Adrian's private cabinet, and that the forged map had been placed in Clara's room before the county hearing. Honoria said nothing. She watched Sebastian taken away in irons with the cold horror of a woman who had mistaken cruelty for cleverness until the cost came due. The inquiry lasted until morning. Clara gave her evidence once, clearly and without exaggeration. The reversed stamp, the false ledger, the altered hinge, the opened salt channel, the intercepted letter, Mrs. Bell's witness, and the paper trail leading back through every order Sebastian had manipulated. When she was finished, the magistrate formally dismissed the treason allegation against her. Captain Sloane apologized in the name of the Crown for the detention order. Clara accepted neither apology nor ceremony as a substitute for what had happened. She asked for 3 things only: that the tenant families receive immediate repair funds from the Ravencourt Estate, that Mrs. Bell be given a lifetime cottage and pension in her own name, and that every public record naming Clara Wycliffe a suspected traitor be corrected before the week ended. Adrian granted all 3 requests before the assembled county. Then he did something no one expected. He removed the Duke's signet ring and placed it on the table before the magistrate. "This ring sealed the order that confined my wife," he said. "It will not seal another estate decision until Lady Ravencourt's independent survey has been reviewed by the Crown engineers and the tenants' representatives." It was not a grand gesture. It was a surrender of the unchecked authority he had used so carelessly. The county would remember it. So would he. In the weeks that followed, Sebastian's leases were seized, while the courts examined the fraud behind them. Honoria lost the settlement she had expected to gain through her brother's rise, and left England under the protection of distant relatives. Mr. Vale gave full evidence in return for leniency, though no testimony spared him disgrace. The northern road was rebuilt under Clara's plans, the harbour gates were repaired with proper fittings, and the tenant cottages were raised above the floodline. Adrian paid every cost from his private funds after the estate accounts were released. He resigned his advisory post to the War Office before he could be dismissed from it. Invitations stopped arriving. Men who had applauded his authority at Kingsmere suddenly found reasons to dine elsewhere. Yet none of that was the punishment Clara cared about most. On a quiet morning at Ravencourt, Adrian came to the map room without an escort, without the signet ring, and without any attempt to soften the truth. The burned papers had been cleared away, but the smell of smoke remained in the walls. "The solicitors have prepared a deed of separate maintenance," he told her. "Your marriage settlement will be restored in full. The North Survey works, the Harbour Commission, and the Flood Recovery Fund will be placed under a trust you control. You will not need my permission to live wherever you choose." Clara stood beside the drainage model, her fingers resting on the miniature east lock. "And what do you want?" she asked. Adrian's face tightened. "Nothing I have a right to ask for. That is the first honest answer you have given me in some time." He accepted the blow without protest. "I loved you," he said. "I may still love you, but I loved being right more when it mattered. I made you pay for that. I cannot ask you to remain my wife because I am sorry for the cost." Clara looked at him for a long moment. The man she had married was still there somewhere beneath the shame and silence, but he was no longer the man she had believed him to be. Trust had not been destroyed by one forged letter or one disastrous signature. It had been destroyed each time he chose not to look at her, not to hear her, not to stand beside her when standing beside her carried a price. "I forgive you," she said at last, "not because you deserve ease from me, but because I refuse to let your failure become the shape of my life." Hope flickered in his eyes. She did not let it grow. "But forgiveness is not a return." Adrian bowed his head. "I understand. I think you finally do. That spring, Clara left Ravencourt not as a prisoner in a guarded coach, but in a carriage loaded with surveying instruments, rolled maps, and the first plans for an independent coastal engineering office in London. Mrs. Bell sat beside her, wrapped in a new blue shawl and complaining cheerfully about city traffic before they had even reached the main road. Thomas rode ahead as Clara's assistant, proud enough to sit straighter than any duke. At the Chapel Ridge, Clara asked the driver to stop. Below them, the restored eastern lock gleamed in the morning sun. The marshes lay green and safe beyond it. In the distance, Adrian stood alone near the gate, not waiting for her, not asking her to return, only watching as the carriage turned toward the future she had chosen. Clara lifted her hand once in farewell, then unfolded a new map across her lap and drew the first clear line of a life that belonged entirely to her.